Hi! Today we will explain the storyline of the movie Honeymoon, which was released in 2014. Okay, let's get right to the story. Bea and Paul just got married in the summer. They recorded a video monologue telling the story of how they met, their first date, and how Paul proposed. Now they are on their way to their honeymoon destination, a cabin owned by Bea's family in the woods. Bea shows Paul around the house, explaining the names of the rooms. Their bedroom faces the forest, so at night the outside looks very dark and creepy. Paul sees a rubber duck toy in the window, and Bea says it's a statue with a hole in the middle. She used to keep things inside it when she was a child. On their first night in the cabin, a spotlight shone brightly on Bea's face, but neither of them woke up. The next morning, Bea woke Paul up with the duck figurine and showed him the letter she had slipped inside. They got up and made breakfast while chatting. Paul commented that Bea should rest her womb after their long first night. This sounded as though Paul wanted Bea to have a child, so she asked him if he wanted to have children. Paul didn't answer firmly. He also didn't know if he wanted to have children. Bea suddenly felt anxious because she wasn't ready to have children. Paul didn't want this question to weigh on Bea's mind and asked her to focus on enjoying their honeymoon. He promised to go about their usual routine before addressing other household issues. After breakfast, Bea took Paul for a boat ride on the lake until midday. Before leaving, Paul admired the black bear skin hanging in Bea's father's hunting room. Bea admitted that her father was a skilled hunter. She then asked Paul if he had ever killed an animal. He admitted he had never killed anything with his bare hands, only mousetraps. Bea then shared that she had once killed a fish and a baby frog. The weather was perfect for outdoor activities. They crossed the lake and stopped in the middle, where Bea showed off her boating skills, such as tying the anchor. Bea wanted to go swimming, but the water was too cold, so she decided to stay on the boat and return to the cabin. They took a shower together and dried off while joking around. After showering, they walked out of the cabin to look for dinner. They found a quiet shop near the cabin run by Bea's old friend named Will. When he saw them arrive, Will said the shop was closed. Will's behavior was very strange. He rudely shooed them away until he recognized Bea and called her Trixie. Bea and Will hugged warmly, complimenting each other's appearance. Bea said Will's hat was cool, while Will looked at Bea as if she were the most beautiful thing he had seen in a long time. Will explained that the shop belonged to his wife's family, Annie. Seeing their closeness, Paul grew a bit jealous and interrupted their conversation. After reminiscing for a while, Will said he would cook something for Bea and Paul. Suddenly, Annie appeared from inside. She also tried to chase Bea and Paul away, but Will immediately told her to be quiet, saying that Annie was sick. They returned to the cabin after it got dark. As they were about to sleep, Bea seemed deep in thought. Paul guessed Bea was still thinking about Will. Bea admitted she was just thinking about Will's wife looking strange. Paul said his wife might be stressed having a husband like Will who behaved aggressively. Bea dismissed Paul's assumption, believing Will was a good man, just hot-tempered. Besides, she had known him since she was 13. Bea suspected Annie had done something to upset Will. A few seconds before Paul's radio alarm went off, the electricity in the cabin was unstable, and the house lights flickered for a moment. Paul promised to catch a big fish for Bea, so he set the alarm. It was still very dark when Paul woke up and grabbed his fishing gear. He checked the time on his cell phone and matched it to the radio clock on the cabin table. However, the two clocks showed different times. Paul's cell phone showed 3:45, while the radio clock showed 12 o'clock. Paul realized that he had woken up too early, so he went back to the bedroom and got ready to go back to sleep. But Bea was not in bed. He thought his wife was in the bathroom, so he complained that the clock was broken. But Bea did not answer at all. He checked the bathroom, but no one was there. He searched for Bea everywhere, but she was nowhere to be found. Paul saw a moth on the kitchen light, so he assumed Bea had gone outside. However, when he followed her to the cabin porch, he didn't see anyone. Paul panicked and told Bea to stop playing around. Paul heard footsteps coming from the forest, so he thought Bea was there and walked in while calling her name. Paul finally found Bea standing with her head down, but she wasn't wearing any clothes. Her behavior seemed strange, so Paul tried to snap her out of it until his wife screamed in shock. Paul immediately put his shirt on Bea, then carried her to the cabin. Bea seemed very confused and apologized for what had happened. Paul was worried because Bea's skin was very cold and her nightgown was missing. Bea tried to calm Paul down and said she was fine, guessing that she must have been sleepwalking. When it was already bright, Bea woke up early. Paul saw her making toast for breakfast in the kitchen. However, B still looked disoriented and forgot how to make toast. As a result, the toast burned. Not only that, B also forgot to make coffee for them. B admitted she felt strange. Paul suggested they go to town because B's behavior was unusual. He had known B for a long time, but this was the first time she had sleepwalked. B said she was probably just tired. However, her strange behavior continued into the afternoon when they went out in a boat to catch frogs at the lake. Paul joked that the frogs would be their dinner, but B didn't find it funny, even though his wife was usually easy to make laugh. B herself didn't know why Paul's joke wasn't funny to her. B continued rowing the boat, and Paul tried to joke with her again, splashing her with water from the oar. B enthusiastically retaliated. Suddenly, B started swimming, even though she had previously been unable to tolerate the lake's freezing water. Paul was stunned by B's sudden change in behavior, but once again, B claimed she didn't know why she had done it. Back in the cabin, B said again that she was just stressed about the trip and her marriage. However, when Paul tried to make her more relaxed, he accidentally saw some small bruises on B's thigh. When Paul tried to check, B panicked and avoided him, saying it was just a mosquito bite. Paul was able to peek at the bite marks while B was taking a nap, and they didn't look like mosquito bites. Paul went into the forest to investigate, to the spot where he had found B earlier that morning, and saw B's torn nightgown on one of the tree trunks. Even stranger, there was some kind of slime on the clothing. Paul returned home and found B talking to herself in front of the bathroom mirror. Before he was discovered, Paul rushed to the living room and turned on the TV. B greeted him and stared at him as if he were a stranger. That night, they lit a bonfire in the backyard and roasted marshmallows. Paul noticed B's unusual behavior, even eating the marshmallows while they were still hot. Soon after, they returned to the cabin and played dice. In the middle of the game, Paul kissed B, but suddenly B claimed she had a headache. Paul immediately felt that B had rejected him. He said that B's attitude had changed after he found her in the forest, but B insisted that she had just been sleepwalking. She tried to cheer Paul up, but Paul told her to change into her pajamas. B's attitude immediately became nervous, and she refused Paul's request. In the middle of the night, Paul caught B awake. He followed her, but B quickly returned and claimed she was just getting a drink, though she didn't have a glass. Shortly after they went back to sleep, Paul woke up again because his eyes were dazzled. Outside, a flashlight was moving, shining on their cabin. Paul quickly got up and raised his rifle, following the direction of the flashlight, which was coming from outside. Paul heard the sound of someone moving quickly among the leaves. He immediately pulled the trigger of his rifle to warn whoever was outside, and B woke up to the sound of the rifle. Paul rushed inside and closed all the curtains, convinced that someone was playing a trick on them. He told B the truth, that he had found her nightgown, which B admitted was in her suitcase, dirty. Paul then explained that he had gone for a walk in the forest earlier that day and found the clothes. Not only that, but Paul also saw footprints belonging to someone else. He immediately concluded that there was someone else outside their cabin, someone who had been spying on B and Paul. Moreover, Paul suspected that B had secretly met with Will. Paul asked B to tell him the truth even if it hurt, but B immediately dismissed all of Paul's accusations and reminded Paul that he had ruined their honeymoon. As a result of the argument, Paul's attitude towards B also changed. He felt tired of pressuring B, but he still cared about her. B wrote something in her diary but immediately closed it when Paul tried to read it. B tried to make up with Paul and offered to help him make breakfast, but Paul responded coldly. Meanwhile, the insect bite on B's thigh looked worse, and the bruise was getting bigger, but B kept denying it and said she was fine. That afternoon, Paul and B went fishing on the lake. Paul admitted he wanted to go home, but B didn't understand since they were enjoying their honeymoon. She tried to change Paul's mind and suggested they get intimate, but suddenly B started bleeding heavily from her groin. They rushed back to the cabin, and Paul suggested taking her to the doctor, but B insisted it was just her period. Paul didn't believe her because he had seen her mark the calendar when she was menstruating. Paul's suspicions grew even stronger after the bruise on her thigh and now the bleeding. He admitted he couldn't hold back anymore and needed to prove that all of B's odd behavior was connected to Will. That night, he went to Will's cabin, but he only saw Annie at the dock. Annie said her husband wasn't home. He was hiding. When Annie stood up to grab the rope, Will saw the same bruise on Annie's thigh and suspected Will was responsible. However, Annie refused to tell him what caused the bruise, saying only that they weren't safe and hurriedly left in the boat. After Annie left, Paul saw Will's favorite hat floating near the dock. He picked it up and noticed a bloodstain on it. He didn't go home immediately but sneaked into Will and Annie's house. Before entering, he saw the CCTV camera lit up above the door. He then got the idea to check the CCTV footage and find out for himself using Will's laptop, which was still on. He replayed several recordings. At first, there was nothing strange until he saw a video of Annie leaving the cabin at midnight. In the recording, Annie was also wearing a nightgown and looked hypnotized, which reminded him of B. However, suddenly the laptop turned off and the desk lamp flickered, illuminating a piece of paper stuck to the wall. Paul walked closer to one of the sheets. Its contents resembled what B had written in her diary earlier that day. He hurried home and checked B's diary. B tried to grab it back, but Paul insisted. He asked her several questions about her identity, such as her name, Paul's role in her life, and her favorite food, all matching what was written in the diary. To Paul, what B wrote was unusual. It was as if she was remembering who she was and where she came from, something that should have been forgotten. Paul showed B a piece of paper he had taken from Will's house, which contained Annie's writing, identical to B's. Paul pressed B to explain why she had written all that. He couldn't understand how two people who had just met could experience the same thing, but B couldn't answer. Paul continued to corner B until she revealed everything she had found. After finding bloodstains on Will's hat, he realized that the similarities between B and Annie were not Will's doing. Paul now suspected that it was Annie's doing, and B finally admitted that she wanted to protect Paul. Paul immediately concluded that they had to leave immediately, but B refused and tried to hold Paul back. Finally, B entered the bathroom and started bleeding again. Paul burst in and was shocked to see a pool of blood on the floor. However, B still refused to leave the cabin. She tried to persuade Paul to sleep and stay with her, but he refused. He wanted the truth and kept pressing B to tell him the whole story. Eventually, Paul became desperate and tied B to the bed. B could only submit. Paul tried to persuade her gently, saying he wanted his wife to return to normal, but B insisted she was still Paul's wife. Despite this, B couldn't answer some of Paul's questions about how they first met and how he proposed. At first, B struggled to answer because she didn't remember. After trying slowly, B answered the questions confidently, but Paul said her answers were wrong. Paul became increasingly suspicious that the woman was not B. He examined B's entire body. Everything was the same as the B he knew, but B still felt different. Finally, Paul touched B's groin and found something abnormal. He pulled out something that looked like a giant worm, but the creature died immediately outside B's body. Paul was stunned and asked what it was. He went outside to calm down, and B followed, telling him what had really happened in the forest the previous night. B said she had experienced something terrifying. She saw a blinding light, then an alien figure appeared. She couldn't see it clearly, but she knew it had a dark black body. The figure extended a part of its body and entered B. Since then, B couldn't see them anymore, but she felt they were still inside her body. The figure knew B, and B knew what they wanted from her. B couldn't do anything but let the figure be, and she couldn't tell Paul because she wasn't allowed to. B asked for a few days to give them what they wanted from her. She told Paul that they controlled her mind and made her confused, taking her identity and leaving only her body behind. Paul was certain he could still save B. He searched for the car keys and tried to persuade B to leave. However, B refused to go. She tried to keep them in the cabin. Paul insisted on finding help, but suddenly, light from outside shone again, illuminating B's face. B said they didn't need Paul and that she was running out of time. B told him they would get rid of Paul. B suddenly realized she had to hide Paul in a place they couldn't find. She wouldn't let them kill Paul, so B hit Paul until he collapsed. Paul woke up when it was already light outside. B had taken him to the middle of the lake in a boat. His body was tightly bound, and B admitted she had to hide Paul underwater. Paul begged B not to drown him, but he couldn't fight B as she lowered the anchor to the bottom of the lake and then submerged Paul's body. Paul didn't resurface, and when B looked down at the bottom of the boat, her face was covered in scales. That night, B sat silently watching the video recording of her wedding with Paul, her eyes vacant, until the same light shone and illuminated B's face. She quickly stood up and walked toward the door, where Annie was already standing there waiting for her. The two of them walked toward the forest, surrendering themselves completely to the mysterious dark figure.